Beginning with this video, I will talk about Bhagavad Gita chapters one by one, with one video dedicated to each chapter. The videos may be long or short depending on how much depth is needed in the discussion, because the breadth of the chapter is already known by the chapter's verses. Through these videos, I will try to do three things. First, I will give an overarching sense of the chapter and bring out its salient points by dividing the chapter into topics and discuss the flow of the chapter from one topic to another. Second, discussion of each topic sometimes requires a detailed discussion of individual verses, and sometimes we can just summarize multiple verses as part of one topic. And so there will be greater or lesser discussion of the verses. Third, I will try to make this understanding of Bhagavad Gita contemporary by contrasting Bhagavad Gita concepts to the ideas prevalent at modern time. I've already begun the third part in detail in the first video in the series entitled The Science of Bhagavad-Gita. So if you haven't watched it yet, I would urge you to begin with that video and understand that while all the Bhagavad Gita ideas are contrary to modern ideas, together they form a consistent and complete science. While the modern ideas are incomplete at best, and attempts to complete them lead to contradictions. My overall approach with this video series is to show the big picture before going into details, and then within each chapter of Bhagavad Gita, show the big picture before going into details. Srila Prabhupada envisioned that his disciples would teach Vedic texts as scientific texts. He actually conceived of four educational programs which he called Bhakti Shastri, Bhakti Vaibhav, Bhakti Vedanta, and Bhakti Sarvabhauma, in which different Vedic texts would be progressively taught in a systematic fashion, and then each course will have examinations to give degrees. He thought of these programs like modern academia conceives of bachelor's, master's, doctorate, and postdoctorate degrees. The Bhagavad Gita teaching was part of the Bhakti Shastri program. While some attempts were made to fulfill Prabhupada's vision of education, the fundamental problem in this education has always been the inability to reconcile or demarcate the Vedic worldview with the modern one and decide which one is true or false, better or worse. Without knowing these differences, it is impossible to even understand the meaning of any Bhagavad Gita verse. For example, the simplest idea of a soul's transmigration from one body to another cannot be understood unless we see the body as a bag of potentials through which the Atma moves one by one, just like a person pulling out different colored balls from a bag of balls one by one. But even if we accept that the Atma is moving through the potentials that were fixed at the time of birth, we still cannot understand the soul's transmigration unless we say that the body is not moving and only the Atma is moving. If bodies are the balls in a bag, then the soul is the hand pulling out these balls from the bag. This requires a shift in causality, which means all causal questions must be applied to the soul rather than the body. The soul causality involves guna, karma, dharma, choices, and rebirth. And for this to be factually true, the body motion has to be explained as the epiphenomena of soul motion. Conversely, if we keep the idea that body is moving, inherited from our current education system and the dominant attitudes of the people around us, then we must also accept the idea of natural forces, mathematical laws, and deterministic or random evolution, which is not just unrelated to guna, karma, dharma, choices, and rebirth, but also contradictory to it. And so we have two alternatives. First, we can either explain body motion based on soul motion, or we can try to explain soul motion based on body motion. Now we know that we cannot explain soul motion based on body motion because the science of body motion came out of monotheism, where soul is always tied to the body as its breath. So we can never have the transmigration of the soul in a science created from monotheism. That is the end of Bhagavad Gita study because transmigration of the soul is the first important topic of the Bhagavad Gita. And if we cannot teach the first important topic because soul body inseparability in monotheism, then we can't teach anything else. And so we have to begin by saying that the body is not moving and only the soul is moving. The body motion science is false and the soul motion science is true. And the soul motion is a temporary soul body attachment described through statements such as I am X, where X can mean childhood, youth, old age, nationality, gender, and so on. At every moment, I am X changes into I am Y. For example, I am child becomes I am youth, which then becomes I am old. Or I am asleep becomes I am awake. Or I am tired becomes I am refreshed. So science is sentence evolution, not body motion. With this clarification, suddenly everything makes sense because life becomes a series of sentences, paragraphs, chapters, and books. There is a logic to this, but that logic is not a mathematical law. It is rather the quest for meaning and purpose, which may be truthful or deluded, successful or failure, progressive or regressive, and so on. Now we can actually talk about all the other topics such as guna, karma, dharma, choice, and rebirth. None of these things make sense in any body motion paradigm, and all of them make sense in the soul motion paradigm. And so we cannot teach anything in Bhagavad Gita under the modern paradigm because of its radical difference from the Vedic paradigm. People may read books and try to understand them, but there will never be a genuine understanding because we are looking at Bhagavad Gita through tinted glasses. So changing the glasses is the first goal, and then seeing Bhagavad Gita fresh through a new pair of goggles is the next goal. This is what I mean by a scientific study of Bhagavad Gita, to contrast it to a religious study. In the religious study, people read Bhagavad Gita without removing their tinted glasses. In the scientific study, we remove the tinted glasses before or alongside or right after everything we read. I began this series with tinted glass removal when I demonstrated how all the six topics of Bhagavad Gita are inverted compared to how the same topics are taught or understood at the present time. A big jolt was necessary to make a start, but now I will give smaller jolts at every step, such as the one above, where I said that the body is not moving and only the soul is moving from body to body to explain Bhagavad Gita verses. If you can absorb all these shocks, then your mind would be transformed exactly like the mind changes in going from childhood to youth to old age. For instance, instead of the childish idea of thinking that the body is moving, you will now accept the wise idea that the soul is moving from body to body. Then you can accept that just as I go through childhood to youth to old age in this life due to guna, karma, dharma, choice, and continuous rebirth into new bodies, similarly, I will go into a new body based on the same principles. The question is, what will be my next body? Once you have gone through this process of changing the mental paradigm, then we can go back and read Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita as it is. And we will see everything in a new light. In fact, we will see what we haven't seen before. So, my attempt at this series is not to replace, let alone contradict, what Prabhupada has written, but to make everyone understand what he has actually written. If everyone was already situated in the Vedic paradigm, this series of videos would be unnecessary. But since nearly everyone is situated in an anti-Vedic paradigm, this series is necessary. The Mahabharata is a long story from a time toward the end of Dwapar Yuga and just before the beginning of Kali Yuga. As you may know, the Vedic texts divide time into yuga cycles, comprising four yugas called Satya, Dwapar, Treta, and Kali. There are thousands such cycles within each day of Brahma, which is called a kalpa. These kalpa are also divided into groups of 71 yuga cycles called a manavantara, and there are 14 manavantara within one kalpa. Within each day of Brahma, all the incarnations of Lord Vishnu appear. However, every incarnation doesn't appear in every yuga cycle or even each manavantara. Some incarnations appear just once within a kalpa, some of them appear once in a manavantara, and some of them appear in every yuga cycle. Due to these multiple appearances, sometimes there are more than one descriptions of the same incarnation in different Puranas, which might differ from one another in some respects and may be similar in other respects. Some people at present disconnect these descriptions from the Yuga cycles and claim that different authors were writing different stories. But that is not true because in these descriptions we find the Yuga and the Manvantara being mentioned. And yet, all these incarnations are eternal forms in the spiritual world. So even if they appear just once in a day of Brahma, they are worshipped after that. For example, Lord Nrsimhadev appeared in the Satyuga of the fourth Yuga cycle of the current Vaivasvat Manvantara, and we are currently in the Kali Yuga of the seventh Yuga cycle of the Vaivasvat Manvantara. And so more than 12 million years have elapsed since the appearance of Lord Nrsimhadev, but he is still worshipped all over the world. The Bhagavad Purana describes the 24 principal incarnations of Lord Vishnu and then states the following. Ete chans kala punsa Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam Indrari Vyakulam Lokam Mrinayanti Yuge Yuge. It means the previous 24 incarnations are just some of the incarnations. Additionally, there are Amsa, Kala, and Purusha incarnations. However, Krishna is Bhagavan Swayam, which means the complete form of Bhagavan, compared to the previous 24 incarnations. And the other ones, such as Amsa, Kala, and Purusha incarnations, are partial forms of Bhagavan. To understand this, we have to know the definition of Bhagavan. The Vishnu Purana defines Bhagavan as follows. Aishwarasya samagrasya virasya yashasa shriya jnana vairagyo chaiva sannam bhaga itingana. It means there are six kinds of bhaga or great qualities, namely knowledge, beauty, independence, wealth, power, and fame. And anyone who has all these six qualities is Bhagavan. However, every form of Bhagavan may not have all the qualities of Bhagavan in full. So, for example, even the nails of Narsimhadev are very beautiful, even though he tears Hiranyakashyap apart with those nails. But the nails of Krishna are the most beautiful. So, in this sense, Krishna is Bhagavan Swayam, which means the complete form of knowledge, beauty, independence, wealth, power, and fame. Krishna appears only once in the day of Brahma, which means just once in a kalpa. And when Krishna appears, the order of Treta and Dwapar Yuga is switched. That means normally Dwapar Yuga comes before Treta Yuga. But when Krishna appears, Treta Yuga appears before Dwapar Yuga. By the nomenclature, we know Dwapar means second part and Treta means third. But when Krishna appears, this order is switched and Treta becomes the second Yuga and Dwapar becomes the third. And so we say that Mahabharata occurred at the end of the Dwapar Yuga, but it is actually the third Yuga and not the second. Of course, when these yuga are switched, their durations also change, which means Treta, which is normally the third yuga, becomes as long as Dwapara, and Dwapar becomes as long as Treta Yuga. And so some confusion is created by the switching of yuga if we start applying this switched yuga state to all previously unswitched yuga cycles. To avoid these confusions, we have to know that once in a kalpa or the day of Brahma, when Krishna appears, the yuga order between Treta and Dwapar is switched rather than the normal order. A yuga is basically defined by the prominence of the four principles of dharma called Satya, Daya, Sauch, and Tap, which means truthfulness, kindness, cleanliness, and austerity. All the four principles are present in Satya Yuga. Then, in the normal Dwapar Yuga, Tapa or austerity declines and the emphasis shifts to Saucha or cleanliness. It means that people don't renounce the world and don't perform as many austerities as in Satya Yuga. But they perform big rituals, and wealth is given away after these rituals. These rituals require a lot of careful planning, organization, and cleanliness. So these big rituals effectively become substitutes of austerity in the normal ages. Then, in the normal Treta Yuga, people can't do austerities or even the big rituals. So they give away their wealth in charity and thus reduce their enjoyment. And that reduction is considered as good as austerity and ritual. Finally, in the normal Kali Yuga, people stop doing austerity, lose the cleanliness to perform big rituals, and don't even have enough wealth to secure their future, so they do not give away their wealth in charity. And so, Satya or education becomes the main dharma. So when we say that Treta and Dwapar Yuga are switched, it means in the preceding Treta Yuga, an age of charity existed for a long time, when it was supposed to be the age for rituals. In contrast, in the Dwapar Yuga that follows, lots of rituals should have been done, when it was actually the age for doing charities. Rituals and charity were the switched by the Yuga switching. In a practical economic sense, it means that when people stop doing austerities and charities, the kings increase their taxes and take more money from people, and then perform big rituals in which the tax revenue is redistributed to the poor people. Otherwise, if people are already doing austerities and charities, then taxes are very low and big rituals to redistribute wealth are not required. So both charity and rituals are the Vedic practice of socialism. One might ask, if socialism could be practiced simply by charity, then why do we need rituals? And the answer is that those who give away their wealth also want to get their wealth back, which is capitalism. They receive their wealth back through big rituals in which the demigods are invited and they are given offerings. After that, the demigods use their power to supply all kinds of natural wealth. So in modern capitalism, the capitalist takes wealth from the poor, but in Vedic capitalism, the capitalist receives wealth from the demigods and then redistributes that wealth to the poor. And so both socialism and capitalism are practiced, but socialism is charity and capitalism is rituals. When these big rituals are performed, the kings become very strong and nobody can defeat them. The kingdoms become very prosperous due to the benediction of the demigods. Now the kings can collect even higher taxes, use it to perform even bigger rituals, and then redistribute the wealth even more. Conversely, when the rituals stop, then the kings become weak and the kingdoms become relatively poorer. And so the kings cannot collect so many taxes. Now there is a higher disparity between rich and poor. Some pious people do charity and rituals, and most simply do charity. But overall, there are more poor people in society. Poverty naturally leads to strife in society, such as the rise in thieves who survive by stealing wealth because charity has stopped. That in turn results in moral decline. When this moral decline appears during Kali Yuga, then kings construct big temples as replacements of big rituals and substitutes for people's charity. For building temples, tax was collected for a few years from the citizens, and thousands of people were employed for construction activity. Once the temple was built, people voluntarily donated money to the temple according to their capacity. And the temple worshipped the deities, did the rituals, and provided free food and education to the whole society at the society's expense. So, whoever was interested could be educated for free, and whoever was hungry could eat the temple's prasad. And so, the temple became the center for both socialism and capitalism. The worshipped deities supply the kingdom with wealth, which is capitalism, and the wealthy people donate to the temple for giving free food and education, which is socialism. Once the society became stable, the kings did not collect high taxes, which they had earlier done for construction, because the temple became the center for charity, rituals, and education, and the kings went back to fighting the thieves. Therefore, when the yuga switch occurs, charities die and the kings must do more rituals. But in the last Dwapar Yuga, we see that Asuric kings rise and collect lots of taxes but don't do rituals and don't redistribute the wealth. Instead, the kings become parasites on people. For example, we see in Krishna's time the life stories of very poor people such as Sudama and Dronacharya who don't even have food to eat. Both of them are highly qualified Brahmanas, and yet they are not employed as Brahmanas because the Asura kings stop Brahmanical activities, after which the Brahmanas struggle to survive. Then we see that after the Mahabharat war, again great rituals such as Rajsuya and Ashwamedha are done. Krishna himself washes the feet of the poor Brahmanas almost to apologize for the hardship they had to endure despite his presence on the earth. All of them are given gifts so that they can now go back to leading a life of dignity. And so there is a very important connection between kings, temples, rituals, charities, prosperity, education, and morality. There is a cyclical process by which wealth is collected and redistributed. In the Kali Yuga, the temples are the center of this activity, while the government simply fights thieves. So if these temples are destroyed, then it has a massive adverse impact on economics because rituals and charities stop, which means the kings become weak, the kingdoms become poor, the wealth disparity rises, strife within society increases, and the net result is more corruption, stealing, and immorality. So while we understand the spiritual implications of rituals and temples, there is also an economic, social, and political impact. Namely, that when temples are destroyed, the economy declines, the politics is ridden with strife, and the society disintegrates via conflicts. The same thing happens if the temple becomes hedonistic and corrupt, whereby it collects money but it doesn't do charity and education. And most of the money is spent in giving the priestly class a luxurious life. In each yoga cycle, there is a progressive decline such that initially people stop austerity, then rituals, then charity, and then even education. Even temples become centers of corruption, immorality, and hedonism, and the whole society declines and decays as a result. Once we understand yuga cycles, then we can talk about the impact of asuras on a yuga. Generally, all asuras operate by the destruction of rituals, charities, temples, and education. This is because it weakens the kings, and after that, they are easily conquered. It leads to economic decline, so whoever remains cannot raise an army to fight back. People stop giving charity because they are afraid of their own future and they hoard wealth for a future rainy day. The net result is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. This then leads to societal strife and creates animosity among people. This internally weakened society is also very easy to rule over, which helps the asuras maintain their control. Then, as people are struggling to survive, education becomes the last priority because education is prioritized after the basic needs have been fulfilled. Finally, with the decline of rituals, charities, and temples, the Brahmanas are destroyed. So they cannot guide society with regard to duty and morality. After that, there is moral decline, ignorance, and hopelessness. As people who upheld dharma and taught it to people, other people are themselves struggling to survive. This brings in the corruption of the Brahmanas themselves, which further reduces people's trust in the Brahmanical class. And the entire society goes downhill from there. And so the Asuras always attack the nerve center of the Vedic tradition in the form of rituals, charities, temples, and education because it weakens the whole society and helps Asuras increase their control and power. After attacking, destroying, and stopping rituals, charities, temples, and education, the Asuras increased taxes on the people so that whatever remaining wealth could be spent on these activities is sucked into the coffers of the Asuras. The Asuras then don't spend this collected tax revenue on rituals, charities, temples, or education. They spend it on wars of conquest, theft of wealth, building oppressive armies, sense enjoyment, and worthless, frivolous activities such as on palaces, parties, games, and other such forms of entertainment. So while the public suffers an immense poverty, the Asuras enjoy at their expense. And if anyone questions or opposes these Asuras, they are killed or imprisoned or tortured to make an example out of them and instill fear in others. This Asuric rule was the situation at the time of Krishna's advent during Dwapar Yuga, with numerous Asuras ruling over Bharat. If we read the Mahabharata, we find dozens of these Asuras, such as Kansa, Shishupala, Jarasandh, Dantavakra, Duryodhan, Dushasan, Narkasur, Putana, Bakasur, Aghasur, Shalya, Bhagadat, Alambush, Alayudh, and so on. Generally, the incarnations of the Lord kill one or two Asuras, but in Krishna's time there were so many. So it was a terrible time, and Krishna came to reset the entire historical trajectory by killing all these Asuras. The Mahabharata is a pivotal event in this destruction of Asuras. When there are so many Asuras, then they have to be put together in a war. In the Mahabharata war, there were a total of 18 Akshani of armies. Each Akshani is about 200,000 warriors. So 18 Akshani is about 3.6 million warriors. In addition, there were animals and charioteers and elephant riders. So at least 5 million humans and at least that many animals. And the Kaurava army was 11 Akshani while Pandava army was 7 Akshani. So there was a 60-40 ratio with the Kauravas being bigger. And this was after Krishna had already killed Kansa and dozens of other demons. That tells us how the Asuras had already taken over Bharat, and before Krishna's appearance, they were the predominant power on the verge of totally destroying dharmic rulers. Without the Mahabharata war, the Vedic tradition would not have survived today. So, this was an absolutely mandatory war. For the last 1000 years, Bharat has been in a similar precipitous condition, almost throughout on the brink of total collapse and annihilation of the Vedic tradition due to the rise of Asuric forces. The irony today is that most people think that these Asuras are hallmarks of enlightenment, science, knowledge, prosperity, virtue, and truth. Bharat is the last place where the Asuras haven't fully destroyed Dharma, but that war is being actively waged as we speak. The additional problem is that this war is not just on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. but on 100 different fronts of economy, media, academia, society, politics, corruption, terrorism, drugs, convergence, environment, and so on. Dharma is on attack from every conceivable angle, and everything that can be weaponized against it has been weaponized. Additionally, we don't have Krishna fighting the war. So we have to all understand Bhagavad Gita and fight that war ourselves. If we don't fight that war, then we will all be ruled by asuras. That means while the public will suffer in poverty, the asuras will enjoy at the public's expense. And if anyone questions or opposes these asuras, they will be simply killed or imprisoned or tortured to make an example out of them and instill fear in others. All those who want to avoid that asuric outcome should learn, teach, and practice Bhagavad Gita. With this background about the Mahabharata war, we can return to the main focus of this video, which is the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita. This chapter describes the statements made by Duryodhana and Arjuna, highlighting the key differences between them. While Duryodhana's statements show his selfish, demanding, and arrogant attitudes, Arjuna's statements show his selfless, humble, and renouncing nature. While Duryodhana is only thinking about his victory and the defeat of the Pandavas, Arjuna thinks about the after effects of the war in which millions of people would be killed. While Duryodhana boasts about the powerful warriors on his side, the Pandava side is fearless and prepared to fight, and yet Arjuna is very circumspect and thinks about the outcomes of war. While Duryodhana is ready to sacrifice soldiers in the war for his victory, Arjuna is ready to sacrifice his rightly deserved kingdom for the greater good. While Duryodhana thinks that might will decide what is right, Arjuna believes that right must rule over might. So, this stark contrast in the first chapter sets the stage for the rest of the Bhagavad Gita. Even if someone has not read the whole of Mahabharata, from one chapter we can glean the differences in the attitudes of the Kauravas and the Pandavas. After that, we know that it is not a war between cousins fighting for kingdom, but about what kind of individuals rule over the world or even the land of Bharat. The war between cousins would be confined to within a family, but a war about the kinds of individuals rule over Bharat will have implications for the whole land and the people in them. And so this is not a war simply for ego, kingdom, or inheritance. It is rather a dharma yuddha, or war for the protection of dharma. The implications of war are not confined to one family, but to millions of people living in the land of Bharat. The war is about whether dharma survives or dies. In the first chapter, we see that Arjuna is ready to renounce his claim to the kingdom and abandon the war. But in later chapters, we see Krishna urging Arjuna to fight. Does that mean Krishna doesn't care for the lives of millions of people? The answer is that those opposed to dharma need to die, and those fighting to support dharma who die in this war are dying for a righteous, moral, and spiritual cause. Life itself is not a gift from God if we cannot live like God in a world created by God. Just like we are not welcome into someone's home if we don't behave in their house as they behave. Conversely, readiness to die for dharma and kill those opposed to dharma is evidence of a person's commitment to dharma. Things like right to life and liberty would be acceptable if we were living in our own home, but we are not. We are living in God's home, so we have to live like God lives in His home. Therefore, readiness to fight the righteous, moral, and spiritual war is a sign of a person's spiritual advancement. And death in such a war always leads them to a better life than their current one. And so there are two radically opposed visions of the Mahabharata war. From the perspective of Kauravas, the war is about a kingdom, and from the perspective of Krishna, it is a war for the protection of Dharma. They are in the same battle but in different wars. By battle, I mean the actions of the bodies fighting the war. And by war, I mean what they think the war is about, or why they are fighting in the war, or what makes the fight rational, justified, and reasonable. Of course, the Bhagavad Gita opens by Arjuna acting as if the battle and the war are both for kingdom. He talks about the loss of brethren, which shows that he doesn't think it is a war for dharma. His view is compassionate, sentimental, and charitable. And yet his compassion, sentiment, and charity are misplaced because he is showing mercy on the criminals, which would further embolden the criminals to commit greater crimes, and the outcome will be worse by mercy. Therefore, Krishna changes Arjuna's ideas from war for kingdom to war for dharma. And that is what the rest of Bhagavad Gita is all about. The shift in Arjuna's views shows that Arjuna came to the battlefield thinking that he was fighting a war for kingdom, while Krishna came to the battlefield thinking that he was fighting a war for dharma. In the first chapter, Arjuna tries to convince Krishna about his compassionate worldview, and in the rest of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna convinces him about the reverse. The Bhagavad Gita is a template for the whole Vedic tradition, based on doubting, inquiring, and convincing. There is no top-down system of commandments. A radical message in Bhagavad Gita is that our ordinary activities can have an extraordinary meaning and purpose. So the battle can be the same and the war can be completely different. This understanding of meaning and purpose of activity was lost in India in the last several centuries. For example, Buddhists and Advaitins advocated peace rather than war. They proclaimed that war was a mundane activity which entangled a soul in the cycle of birth and death, while liberation from this cycle required peace. And so the adoption of Buddhism and Advaita inverted the message of Bhagavad Gita with regard to dharmic war, which led to the conquest of India by invaders, because philosophy now said that all wars are mundane rather than spiritual activities. Meanwhile, war for the invading religions was a holy war and not just a mundane war. While Indians made war mundane, the invaders made the war holy, and the results were totally disastrous. To undo that disaster, we have to understand how the world is meaningful and purposeful and not mundane, unlike the claims of Buddhists and Advaitins. This we discussed in the last video as the understanding of Prakriti. Of course, that meaning and purpose can both be true or false, so we never equate the existence of the world to the truth of the world. But the world is not meaningless or purposeless, and therefore all wars or battles cannot be called mundane activities. In fact, they become spiritual activities if behind the activity is transcendental meaning and purpose. This is sometimes called the underdetermination of cause by the effect. Two different causes can lay behind the same effect, and so we cannot say that all wars are mundane or evil. So even if our body is temporary, but it is used for a transcendental purpose, the Atma progresses spiritually because it wholeheartedly accepts a transcendent meaning and purpose, even if for a short while. Conversely, those who call all wars mundane reject the transcendental meaning and purpose, neglect their duties, and thereby their spiritual progress. This is also what happened in India. People abandoned their duties and became highly individualistic, believing that it is necessary for their liberation, and the result was even greater bondage rather than liberation. As we have discussed in the previous video, Prakriti is both meaning and purpose. The Atma comes to this world when it rejects the transcendent purpose in Ishvara and invents its own meanings, which become its bodies. Then it seems like everything is mundane. To get out of that mundaneness, we have to change our purpose to Ishvara. Then, as our purpose changes, the original cause of coming to this world is renounced, and then one re enters transcendence. And so, wars are not mundane if their meaning and purpose is transcendent, because when the Atma serves the Ishvara, the transcendent becomes immanent. And that immanence of the transcendent transforms even that which might have earlier seemed mundane into something that is transcendent. The transcendent becoming immanent is called yoga, which means union of the Ishvara and Jiva by meaning and purpose. Meanwhile, those who think that the world is meaningless and purposeless should leave the world and become self absorbed, because we cannot stay in a world after calling it meaningless and purposeless. The Advaitins called self absorption mukti, but it is not yoga or vice versa. Genuine mukti or liberation is acceptance of true meaning and purpose, not the renunciation of all meaning and purpose. But Advaita Mukti selfishly renounces all meaning and purpose. As we have discussed in the earlier video, the mundane purpose is individualism, such as fighting for oneself, and the transcendent purpose is yoga, such as fighting for the pleasure of Ishvara. Of course, we have to know whether something actually pleases Ishvara. We cannot simply fight and claim that it pleases God while we are fighting for our pleasure. To make that distinction, we have to know what pleases Ishvara, namely the protection of truth and virtue. So every war is not a spiritual or holy war. Only those wars that protect truth and virtue are spiritual or holy wars. Therefore, we have to know what truth and virtue are, and then we can know that we are fighting for protecting truth and virtue, and then we can know that it is a spiritual and holy war and not a mundane war. So the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita is about Arjuna claiming that this war is a mundane war for kingdom, and then Krishna teaching him truth and virtue to tell him that this is a spiritual war. Prakriti is not mundane in Bhagavad Gita. In fact, Krishna calls Prakriti Devi or divine. The divinity of Prakriti is that if the soul deviates from the divine purpose and meaning, then Prakriti punishes the Atma. If Prakriti were not divine, anyone could do anything they wanted, and there would be no reward or punishment. The existence of reward and punishment or freedom from both is the divinity of Prakriti. And so the Atma becomes divine if its purpose is same as that of Ishvara, and becomes mundane if its purpose deviates from that of the Ishvara. Meanwhile, Prakriti is always divine. Therefore, factually, nothing is mundane even in the material world, because Ishvara and Prakriti are always divine, and the Atma is temporarily mundane and eternally divine. And so, any ideology that calls Prakriti mundane or the Atma being a temporary entity and hence mundane is an anti Vedic ideology. And yet, these anti Vedic ideologies in the form of Buddhism and Advaita became very prominent in the last few millennia. They advocated the idea that the world is mundane and the worldly wars are therefore mundane. And so, they brought India to the precipice of annihilation. That would never happen if we studied, understood, practiced, and taught Bhagavad Gita. The basic principle is that nothing is mundane if it aligns with the meaning and purpose of the Ishvara, and everything that deviates from that meaning and purpose is mundane. The world is not mundane by itself. It is our deviated meanings and purposes based on our individualism that make the world mundane. Now, many people at present believe and say that Advaita and Vaishnava interpretations of Bhagavad Gita are simply personal opinions, and both opinions could be valid. This is actually a false claim because beginning with the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, the impersonalist viewpoint is repeatedly refuted. For example, in chapter 2, verse 12, Krishna says, Natu evaham jatu nasham natvam neme janadipa nachaiva na bhavishyama sarve vayam atah param. It means, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in the future shall any of us cease to be. The Sanskrit words are aham, tvam, and vayam, which stand for I, you, and us. All these existed in the past, exist in the present, and will exist in the future, according to the Bhagavad Gita. Meanwhile, Advaita insists that I, you, and us did not exist in the distant past, only exist in the present, and will not exist in a distant future. That is a contradiction of Bhagavad Gita. Similarly, in Bhagavad Gita chapter 15, verse 7, Krishna says, Mamaivansa jiva loke jiva bhut sanatana, which means all these living entities or jiva and their places of living are my eternal parts. Meanwhile, Advaita says that all these individual jiva are simply illusions, and Krishna is yet another jiva. And when they all merge into oneness, that is Brahman. This is a clear contradiction with Bhagavad Gita. Likewise, in Bhagavad Gita, chapter 18, verse 54, Krishna says, Brahmabhuta prasannatma na sochati na kangshati, sama sarveshu bhuteshu madbhaktim labte param. It means that one who has attained the Brahmabhuta stage neither hankers nor laments, is equally disposed towards all the living entities, and then he attains devotion to me. But Advaita says devotion is an inferior condition and a preliminary stepping stone to reach the oneness of Brahman. Again, there is a contradiction where Bhagavad Gita says that devotion is attained after Brahman realization, and Advaita says that devotion is at best a preliminary step towards Brahman realization. In this way, there are numerous contradictions between Advaita and Bhagavad Gita, so they aren't simply opinions. The Advaita view is contradicted by Bhagavad Gita numerous times, and we will discuss these contradictions in detail while discussing the Bhagavad Gita chapters. Right here, I have given three clear and unambiguous examples of contradictions between Advaita and Bhagavad Gita, which prove that Advaita is a misinterpretation of the Bhagavad Gita. This fact is true not just of Bhagavad Gita but of all Vedic texts. Advaita operates by giving an impersonalist interpretation to some verses, such as those in the 13th chapter where it talks about Kshetra and Kshetrajna. For instance, chapter 13, verse 1 opens by Arjuna saying the following: Prakritim Purusham Chaiva Kshetram Kshetragnam Eva Cha. Here, Arjuna is inquiring from Krishna about the differences between Prakriti, Purusha, Kshetra, and Kshetrajna. Prakriti is the whole material nature. Purusha is the creator, controller, and enjoyer of the world of Prakriti. But Kshetra is the limited personal space of each Atma that we call our experience. And the Kshetrajna is the limited Atma with limited experiences. The difference is obvious from the question itself because four terms are used, namely Prakriti, Purusha, Kshetra, and Kshetrajna. But Advaita merges the Kshetrajna with Purusha and Kshetra with Prakriti, which is never supported in Bhagavad Gita. And yet, by this sleight of hand, the Jiva becomes Purusha and a limited personal experience becomes the cosmic reality. In this way, Advaita has been deceiving people for centuries by misrepresenting Bhagavad Gita. In fact, Advaita has been doing to the Vedic text exactly what Western interpreters have been doing to the Vedic text for centuries now, namely giving false interpretations contradictory to and unsupported by the text. Advaita is not part of the Vedic tradition, even though people writing Advaita commentaries may have an Indian body or skin color. The whole world has been fooled into thinking that when Indian bodied or brown skinned people comment on Vedic texts, they must be honest and truthful. When the other types of bodies or skin colors comment, then they are mostly false. This racist and materialistic conception of truth and falsehood is an utter lie. We have the text to check what the correct and incorrect interpretations are, so we don't need skin color to decide that. And comparison with the text shows that Advaita has been doing the same type of false interpretations as the malicious Western counterparts. There is no fundamental difference between these two as far as their interpretations are concerned. Just as the Vedic traditionalists reject the false Western interpretations, they must also reject the Advaita interpretations on the same grounds. Using a racist ground for rejection or acceptance is betrayal of the Vedic tradition, truth, universality, and eternity. And yet, these racist grounds are widely used at present because most people are too ignorant or lazy to study the book and compare the interpretations before arriving at any conclusion. In this video series, we will try to debunk many of these mythologies. Bhagavad Gita opens with Dhritarashtra saying to Sanjaya, Dharmakshetre Kurukshetre Samveta Mamakaha Pandavas Chaiva Kim Akurvat Sanjaya. This verse shows the hypocrisy of Dhritarashtra because on the one hand he talks about Dharmakshetre Kurukshetre, indicating that he is living in a dharmic place, and this dharmic place is called the land of the Kurus. And on the other hand, he clearly demarcates his sons from the sons of Pandu by calling them Mamaka Pandavas Chaiva. Dharma means doing justice and the greatest good, even if it means temporarily sacrificing what seems good for one's body. And yet, Dhritarashtra distinguishes between his sons and the sons of Pandu based on the body, and yet calls himself a dharmic by invoking his descent from the Kurus. His prestigious claim of living in a dharmic place is based on his bodily ancestry and inheritance of the Kuru dynasty, but his personal actions are unjust, discriminatory, and divisive. This type of hypocrisy is common and normal at present. People claim to be religious or pious simply based on geographical, racial, or ancestral inheritance, while their actions are immoral, divisive, and discriminatory. We can see this pattern in racist religions today. The descendants of one skin color or people of some landmass or a tribe of people who lived in one landmass at one time claim to be religious, pious, blessed, or privileged. And then, based on this materialistic appropriation of religiosity, piety, blessedness, or privilege, they separate themselves from the others, exactly like Dhritarashtra claims himself to be a resident of a pious land and then separates his sons from the sons of Pandu because only he and his sons inherit the privilege of piety. The son of Dhritarashtra, that is Duryodhana, is even worse. He opens his mouth by mocking Dronacharya, his teacher, by saying that your intelligent disciple, namely Drishtadumna, who is the son of Drupad, has arranged the army of Pandavas. Now, for those who may not know Mahabharata, Drupad was a friend of Dronacharya during his childhood when they were studying together in a Gurukula. Later on, Drupad became a king and Dronacharya remained very poor. In fact, he was so poor that his wife was mixing wheat flour into water and feeding it to their son as milk. So his wife urged Dronacharya to go to his old friend Drupad and ask for some help. Upon his wife's insistence, Dronacharya went to Drupad But Drupad rejected Dronacharya's dearly held ideas of childhood friendship, saying that those promises or vows were made during childhood were made in ignorance, and the words of the juvenile need not be taken seriously by the adults. Dronacharya was deeply hurt and humiliated, and he vowed to avenge this humiliation in future. And yet, when Drupad's son Drishtadyumna came to Dronacharya to learn from him as a teacher, Dronacharya taught him just like his other disciples. So now Duryodhan mocks him by saying that the son whom you taught has betrayed you, and the father you vowed to avenge is standing right in front. And even the Pandavas you taught are now your enemies. So I am the only friend you have. You have betrayed yourself, and I am now giving you the opportunity to redeem yourself. After humiliating Dronacharya in this way, Duryodhan goes on to say that while Pandavas have many strong warriors, even I have many warriors who could lead my military force, implying that if Dronacharya is unwilling to fight, then there are ready substitutes for him. In other words, Duryodhan doesn't depend on Dronacharya, but Dronacharya depends on Duryodhan. In this way, Duryodhan displays all the classic traits of an Asura, who treats his well-wishers worse than his enemies, in the sense that he shows some respect to his enemies, but for his subordinates he has no respect at all, because he considers them replaceable, while describing how many people are ready to die at his call while they have no other alternative. Factually, both Kauravas and Pandavas are descendants of the Kuru dynasty, so they could equally be called Kurus. But throughout the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna never uses the word Kuru for the Pandavas. Instead, he addresses Arjuna as Bharat, Partha, Kaunteya, Dhananjaya, Mahabaho, Parantapa, and so on. But he never calls Arjuna Kuru. So when Arjuna asks Krishna to move his chariot in between the armies so he can see who is about to fight, Krishna moves the chariot and calls Arjuna Partha, which means the son of Pritha, which was the name for Kunti. And pointing to the opposing army, he says, just behold all the Kurus assembled here. So even as Pandavas belong to the Kuru dynasty, Krishna calls them by their father's name or mother's name or the name of the great ancestor Bharat, but never by their dynastical name. The Kauravas had already taken the dynastical heritage of the Kurus, so Krishna also severs the family connection. Now, the Vedic texts state that Ishvara has no duality. He is called Jnanam Advayam in the Bhagavad Purana. So, why this duality of us versus them? The answer is that the Ishvara behaves with the Atma just as the Atma behaves with the Ishvara. His behavior is tit for tat. So, if Kauravas want to separate themselves from Ishvara, which they did when they tried to imprison Krishna as he went as a messenger to broker peace with the Pandavas, then Ishvara also separates himself from them. They are no longer family, relatives, or even friends. By treating Krishna as an enemy, Krishna becomes their enemy. Of course, that enmity is not permanent. If the Atma again becomes devoted to Krishna, then Krishna again becomes devoted to them. So Krishna is towards us whatever we are towards him. If we think of him as a child, then he becomes a child. If we think of him as a friend, then he becomes a friend. And if we think of him as an enemy, then he becomes an enemy. So this is the real meaning of non-duality, namely that Krishna can be anything we want him to be. Just because he is the origin of everyone doesn't mean he won't be a child. Just because he was enemy in the past doesn't mean he cannot be a friend now. And so non duality doesn't mean oneness, it means that Krishna is everything. However, we are not everything. Since we are a small subset of all possible things, so we want Krishna to be just those subset of things. And then he becomes those things we want him to be. This is the comprehensive rejection of objective truth. The Upanishad says, Ekam Satyam Vipra Bahudha Vadanti, which means there is one truth, but the knowers of the truth describe him in many ways. Those many ways include opposite ways such as parent and child, friend and enemy. But this is not arbitrariness because the one truth adapts according to our nature. If we become Krishna's enemy, then Krishna is not going to treat us as a friend. If we think we are separate from Krishna, then Krishna doesn't consider us family. In fact, he separates his family from the legacy of the tainted people and calls them by names that match their true nature, such as the nature of Pandu or Kunti or Maharaj Bharat, or by their other qualities such as bravery, victorious nature, etc. All the names that Krishna uses for Arjuna are not synonymous. Rather, with each name, Krishna invokes a particular identity of the same person, which means even Arjuna has many identities, qualities, and personalities, just like Krishna. Even Arjuna is not objective truth. Rather, with different kinds of statements, a different name is used to invoke a different identity, as if Krishna is now talking to a different personality of the same person. So in this verse, Krishna calls Arjuna Partha because Pritha was Kunti's birth name and she was later adopted by King Kunti Bhoja, who was childless, and then she came to be known as Kunti. So generally, nobody called Kunti Pritha because that was her childhood name. Formally, for everyone, she was Kunti. But Krishna, who is very intimate with Arjuna, calls Arjuna by the childhood name of his mother as Partha. In this way, we can see how Krishna is so intimate with Arjuna and so distant from the Kauravas that there is a lot of intimate dynamics and emotions being exchanged in addition to the words. And in different places, that mood changes when Krishna calls Arjuna by different names. Similarly, we could spend hours and hours just discussing the various names that Arjuna uses for Krishna, such as Achyuta, Hrishikesha, Govinda, Madhusudana, Janardana, Keshava, Yadava, etc. These names are also not synonymous. Each name has a different meaning, and when the same person is called by a different name, a different emotion is invoked. But if we start discussing all these emotions, then everything will become very long, and so we will not do that extensively. I have just noted this nuance here to highlight the fact that those who want to dive into the mellows of Bhagavad Gita should pay great attention to names. We need emotional intelligence in addition to rational intelligence to understand Bhagavad Gita. But for the present series, I will largely focus on the rational intelligence part. And if someone becomes a devotee of Krishna, he can himself feel these emotions. In modern psychology, there is a very famous dynamic called the empath narcissist dynamic. It's basically a dynamic of good versus evil, but it is not called good versus evil to separate it from religious overtones. The empath is the good guy and the narcissist is the evil guy. In this conversation, Arjuna is the good guy and the Kauravas are the evil guys. But that good versus evil is illustrated through their traits and thought patterns and not simply through a belief in some ideology. Arjuna's good nature is seen through his three-part argument against fighting the Mahabharata war. The first argument is emotional. It says that we enjoy our life with our brothers, teachers, parents, children, and relatives. So if we fight the Mahabharata war, then all these people will be dead. The operation would be successful and yet the patient would have died. Then what will we do with this kingdom? It will simply be empty palaces and enormous wealth, but nobody to enjoy it with. The second argument is moral. It says that if we kill all these people simply for the greed of kingdom and wealth, then we would commit lots of sins and then we will enter hellish life. So even if we enjoy the kingdom and wealth right now, the future will be very painful. If we put the present and the future in balance, the net result will be nothing. So there is no reason to fight. The third argument is rational. It says that if somehow I can enjoy life at present and then escape the hellish punishment in future, the society at large would definitely be destroyed. When men die in this war, then who will take care of women and children? Without such caretakers, both women and children will be abandoned and corrupted, and that will destroy the society at large. Now we can contrast this thinking to that of the Kauravas. They are certainly not worried about the welfare of society at large. They are not even worried about committing sins or going to hell. Finally, they don't even care if their relatives, friends, brothers, teachers, and children are dead. The Kauravas don't mind an empty palace with a lot of wealth. In fact, that is the preferred option for them. Because if all those who could have shared the wealth and power with them are gone, then they would get even more exclusivity in wealth and power, which will validate them even more. And so, this is the contrast between the good and the evil, namely, that all the arguments given by the good people are rejected by the evil people because they don't think of the society at large, their own future misery, or even the destruction of their loved ones. As we have discussed in the previous video, the hallmark of the material condition is individualism. An individualist doesn't think about society, family, or love. He doesn't think about his own future because his conception of life is limited to the present body. So he is laser focused on his immediate interest, not in the future, not of the family, and certainly not of the society. And so the arguments that make sense to the good guys make no sense to the evil guys. Because hidden in the argument is the assumption of a desirable outcome, state, or conclusion. But the desirable outcomes for the good and evil guys are mutually inverted. A good guy is a collectivist and an evil guy is an individualist. This good versus evil dynamic is called the empath narcissist dynamic. The good guy keeps trying for greater good, and the evil guy keeps looking for his own immediate benefit. So the evil guy includes himself in the good guy's greater good, and then he only does things for his immediate benefit, disregarding the greater good, the empath's good, and even his own future good. If we know this empath versus narcissist dynamic, we can immediately understand the good versus evil difference quite differently from how this difference is described and defined based on some belief in some God, Savior, or salvation. Those relying on good versus evil based on some book or some idea of salvation may be narcissistic people. They thrive on the empath's mercy and yet they keep undermining the empath. During Greek times, Aristotle called the three-part argument pathos, ethos, and logos. Pathos is the emotional argument, that which focuses on the good or bad. Ethos is the ethical or moral argument that focuses on the right and wrong. Finally, logos is the rational argument that focuses on true and false. Now we have to remember that this tripartite argument structure exists only for persons. If we depersonalize reality, then immediately the emotional and the moral argument go down the drain because objects have no emotions or morals. Now, rationality becomes reductionism, which means to atomize the whole into parts, study individual parts, and assume that the whole is nothing but the sum of its parts. So, even as Aristotle put forward the three-part argument structure in terms of pathos, ethos, and logos, he also depersonalized reality as geometry and arithmetic, and thus destroyed the pathos and ethos. And then rationality was also reduced to individual welfare rather than collective welfare. Subsequently, in Christianity, pathos became God's love for mankind, whereby he forgives all of man's sins. And ethos became whatever laws an autocratic, theocratic, or democratic system created in its own interest, disregarding the collective interest. Finally, rationality was defined as each man thinking for himself. And so, even today, ethos, pathos, and logos exist, but they are the ethos, pathos, and logos of the individualist or narcissist, not the ethos, pathos, and logos of a collectivist or empath. This three-part argument structure is a reflection of the tripartite nature of the Atma called Sat Chit Anand. The Anand is the emotional aspect, the Chit is the rational aspect, and Sat is the moral aspect. However, this Atma, as we have discussed, is a part of the Ishvara, and yet it forgets its parthood and pretends to be an individualist. And so, if the Atma knows that it is a part of Ishvara, then the emotional, moral, and rational arguments are different than if the Atma forgets its parthood of Ishvara and pretends to be an individualist. The empath thinks about family, love, and moral duty. He thinks about collective welfare. But the narcissist thinks about using family, exploiting others, and individual welfare. So, simply by forgetting parthood, the logos, ethos, and pathos are inverted. And thus, the empath's arguments make no sense to the narcissist, and the narcissist's argument make no sense to the empath. Because behind these arguments is an assumption, namely of separateness versus integration, or collective good versus individual good. Once the actions are changed, all the meaningful and true arguments become meaningless and false. Arjuna calls Krishna Govinda while making the emotional argument because Govinda means one who pleases all the senses. So, normally in a family life, the family pleases each other's senses. Everyone works for each other's welfare and thus they live in harmony. This kind of harmony exists eternally in the spiritual realm, in which Govinda is the most pleasing to everyone, and everyone else is a part of Govinda. So they are also pleasing to each other, but not as much as Govinda. And so, while talking about love and brotherhood of fathers, sons, grandfathers, uncles, fathers in law, grandsons, brother in law, etc., Arjuna addresses Krishna as Govinda. Arjuna is saying that you are the one who pleases everyone. So, how can you ask me to cause others displeasure? Then Arjuna also calls Krishna Madhusudana, which has two meanings. The first meaning is honey, and the second meaning is the demon named Madhu. So, when Arjuna talks about teachers, fathers, sons, grandfathers, uncles, fathers in law, grandsons, brothers in law, etc., and says that through these intimate relationships, we know that they are not our enemies, they are instead our family. So, how can we treat them as the demon Madhu? We should rather be prepared to give up our own lives, just like family members sacrifice their personal happiness for the happiness of their family members. Similarly, by calling Krishna Madhusudana, he is saying that right now you are the enemy of honey, which is in this case means love, empathy, compassion, and family. So there is a double entendre of Madhusudana. The first meaning is that these relatives are not my enemies. So we should not act against them as Madhusudana, that is, they're killers. The second meaning is that right now Krishna is acting like Madhusudana, which means that he is trying to destroy love, empathy, compassion, and family. So, by this double meaning, two separate types of statements are made. While making the moral argument, Arjuna calls Krishna Janardhan, which means the protector of all living entities. This protection is granted based on karma. So, those who have done good deeds are rewarded, and those who have done bad deeds are punished. In every society, the government is supposed to be an incarnation of Janardana, which means rewarding the good people and punishing the bad people. So, karma is protection. It means that if I have not done anything bad, then I am protected by Janardhan. I don't have to worry about what others are doing because they will reap the results of their actions, and I will reap the results of my actions. So, Arjuna is asking Krishna, since you are the protector of morality in society, how can you ask me to do sins? Similarly, Arjuna calls Krishna Madhava. Madhava comprises of two roots, namely Ma, which means mine or mother, and Dhava, which means protector or husband. So Madhava can mean my protector or it can mean the husband of the mother. So just like a father. Sometimes Madhava is translated as the husband of Lakshmi because Lakshmi is mother and Madhava is her husband. Madhava also means nourishing like honey. Honey actually contains the ingredients of thousands of different kinds of flowers. And so Madhava is nourisher in thousands of different ways. So by calling Krishna Madhava, Arjuna is asking, you are just like my protector, guide, and father. So how can you push me into a sinful path where I will do immoral things and then I shall suffer? After giving the arguments based on emotions and piety, Arjuna turns toward the rational argument. Now remember, by rationality we mean whole and part. It is not the rationality of whole reduced to the parts, exerting laws and forces on other parts based on their own selfish interest. So many people may feel confused when I call this a rational argument because their idea of rationality is influenced or based upon modern monotheistic, Western, materialistic, and selfish ideas. By rational, I mean whole and part. So taking care of the collective society and population is rationality. This rationality comes from the realization that no individual exists in an isolation. Rather, we all exist in ecosystems of life. And so, if we destroy the ecosystem, then we will also destroy ourselves. So, while invoking this argument, Arjuna calls Krishna Varshaneya, which means the descendant of Vrishni, who was a great ruler in the Yadu dynasty clan. This dynasty initially lived in the city of Mathura and then moved over to Dwarka. Now, this is something most people don't understand about Bharat if they look at Bharat from a migratory and immigratory lens, like they see Europe or most of the Western world. Initially, Europeans were small migratory tribes similar to clans in Bharat earlier, who migrated from Central Asia. Then they mixed, and the varied clans became countries. But if you go back in time, these were patrilineal clans, which means women came from other clans, but the clan was identified by the male lineage. So in these clans, there is not much difference between the ruler and the ruled. For example, even though Krishna killed Kamsa, he did not become the head of the Yadu clan. Instead, everyone appointed Ugrasena as the clan leader because he was the elder and was already ruling over Mathura before Kansa, his son, had overthrown him. So the ruler was simply the first among the equals because it was like a family. And thus, Arjuna invokes Krishna's status as a member of a clan and says, if we fight, all the men will be killed, then where will the women go? Unprotected and unsafe, these women will be forced to marry whoever they can find, and the result will be a mixed population, which means neither Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, or Shudra. They will all be incompetent and the clan will die. Nobody will remember their ancestors, they will forget their traditions and culture, and the result will be societal degradation. And after that, they will all descend into immorality and go to hell. And so, you, Krishna, who is himself a member of the Yadu clan and the descendant of the great king Vrishni, how can you expect me to become a party to the destruction of all these clans? In the last video, we talked about double standards, which means one thing for me and another thing for you. Now, to the extent that everyone is in a different role in a society with different abilities and proclivities, there are some differences between people. For example, there are differences between genders, between adults and children, between Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. However, those differences begin reducing as we narrow down into a single type or category. For example, we can talk about a similar standard for children for the same gender belonging to the same class, such as Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Then, even though there are some differences, they are not as drastic unless there are exigent, exceptional, and extraordinary circumstances. Now, the Mahabharata war is an exigent, exceptional, and extraordinary circumstance. It's not normal that millions of people gather to fight. But Arjuna doesn't think it is an exigent, exceptional, or extraordinary situation. He thinks this is just an ordinary family quarrel for family inheritance, being fought for the preservation of one's ego. He has forgotten all the injustices, mistreatments, and humiliations he has himself suffered. He has ignored the fact that all these injustices, mistreatments, and humiliations are not just his personal problems, but have wide societal implications. And so, under this forgetfulness and disregard for the exigent, exceptional, and extraordinary circumstances, Arjuna is beseeching Krishna and asking him, "You are the source of happiness, morality, and rationality. So, how can you expect me to violate your nature? I am basically just like you, and I want to be happy, moral, and rational. So, how can you expect me to go against your nature?" And so, all of Arjuna's arguments are accusing Krishna of double standards. He is happy, but he expects me to bring misery. He is moral, but he wants me to bring injustice. He is rational, but he expects me to be irrational. Although all these things are said without malice, the implication is clear. Krishna, you follow one standard and you are asking me to follow another standard. And then Arjuna concludes, I will not do it. Why? Because I am just like you. I am not of a nature different from you. So how can you expect me to do what you will not do it yourself? And so this is the tete-a-tete of a devotee with his Lord. It is an intimate and private conversation between two people who are headbutting and yet without any malice or competition. In fact, Arjuna is trying to prove to Krishna that his loving, moral, and rational stance is just like that of Krishna by calling him Govinda, Janardhan, and Varshaneya. In this headbutting, Arjuna is accusing Krishna of double standards, and then he puts his weapons down. But still, he is not happy. His mind is still filled with grief, which means, despite his arguments, he is himself not sure. If Arjuna was sure of what he had said, he would be filled with joy instead of grief. If he was malicious, he would have said to Krishna, Aha, caught you in your duplicity. But he doesn't do that. He is grief stricken because despite all his arguments, he knows that something is wrong. And so in the next chapter, we will see how Krishna takes Arjuna out of his own doubt about his arguments. The devotees of the Lord often argue with the Lord. Even in the Bible, there is a book of Job in which Job argues with God about why he sent him so much suffering when he has been very good. The difference is that Job ends with no real answers and accepts that everything is God's inconceivable plan, while Arjuna argues and then he gets clarifying answers, after which he fights with full conviction. So, argument is not a bad thing provided one is ready to listen. And when one is ready to listen, there must be clear answers. The problems arise when we shut down the argument, or we are unprepared to listen, or when we don't get answers. And that is where Bhagavad Gita differs. Krishna doesn't shut down the argument, calling it disobedience or heresy. Arjuna remains prepared to listen, and finally, the conversation produces clear answers leading to conviction. Anyone can argue and conclude that everything is God's inconceivable plan. That is faith and belief, not science and truth. So, to do science instead of belief, we have to accept arguments, remain prepared to listen, and then receive clarifying answers that lead to conviction.